Hi, this is Paula Ellis, and welcome to Book Circle Online. I'm here with Shaka Senghor, and we're going to talk about this amazing memoir that he's written, Righting My Wrong. So stay tuned.
This is Book Circle Online, featuring in-depth discussion, insight, news, and commentary on all the world's leading book titles and their authors. And now, Book Circle Online.
It's beautiful, right?
Yeah, I love this song. Has a lot of personal meanings.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
I'm
welcome.
excited. Thank you.
Excited to have you here.
I'm actually excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just tell you, I just wanted to start out and tell you how courageous I think you're willing to share this story over and over and over is. I think I told you earlier that, a lot of times when we do something, we don't necessarily want to talk about it or tell people about it. Sometimes we go and bury our head in the sand. And for you to tell this story over and over, something that is so difficult to have to talk about all the time, I think is amazingly courageous for you to be able to do that. So thank you for willing to do that. And with that, I want to ask you, why write the book, right? Why do that?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the great way of setting that question up. I think it's really important for people to understand that this is not an easy thing to do. Writing a book just in general is a great undertaking for anybody to really stay focused and get a story out. But this was very, very personal. And one of the things that inspired me to write my memoir is the work that I was doing in the community that I came from after I returned home from prison. And the things that I just saw being said about young black men and young black women who were growing up in tough circumstances, I really felt were unfair. We deal with some very difficult circumstances in a lot of the communities throughout the country. From Detroit. Detroit has a tough history of gun violence and, murder rates. And, Chicago is our next door neighbor, and we know the story there. But I feel like there's a story behind the story. And that story is, how do so many of our young men and women coming from these environments end up in this cycle of violence and gun violence and prison and juveniles and felonies and things like that typically limits a person's long-term growth in terms of just being a part of society. And so I really wanted to tell that story. Like, what is the story behind, the story? Because what happens in a lot of instances is there'll be an act of violence committed, and you'll see that splashed across the news, young person shoots such and such, the end. No beginning, no backstory, no context. And so what it has done is it has basically stereotyped, young men and women from these communities as being incorrigible, violent-prone predators. And that's just not the reality. It's a systematic thing, but it's also a very personal, traumatic experience. And I really wanted people to be able to see that.
So let's start with your story behind the story. Tell us about James White.
Yeah, so I grew up, in a household that looks like the model for working class, middle class Black America. My father was in the military, in the Air Force. He also worked for the state, and my mother was primarily a homemaker. And tragically and unfortunately, my mother was abusive. And, growing up, I didn't understand that hurt people. So I had no context to draw from. I didn't know my mother's story. I didn't know her backstory. I didn't know the trauma she experienced from the time she was a child into early adulthood when she began having children. And so not having that context of understanding, all I knew was that the woman that's supposed to be loving me is the woman that's hurting me. And so I decided to run away. And when I made that decision, I was a naive kid, just thinking that somebody would just take me in and say, okay, this kid is smart, honor roll scholarship student. All he just needs is some love and attention and affection, and he'll be all right. And unfortunately, it just doesn't work like that. And, you know, across this country, there are countless teenagers who are hanging out at gas stations and liquor stores. They're basically transient homeless. And people prey on that. They prey on that vulnerability. They prey on you not having somewhere to sleep and you not having a means to provide for yourself. And so that was how I got seduced into the drug trade. And you know, when I entered that culture, this was the beginning of crack cocaine emerging in inner cities. And so I was completely clueless as to how devastating of an impact that the drug would have on society as a whole.
Right.
In general, and then what it would do to me, you know, specifically. And within the first 6 months, I experienced, you know, all the horror that comes with that culture.
Do you remember when, because as I was reading the book, there's a paragraph in here, and I marked it to share. You say, as I stood there in cuffs, my thoughts wandered back to my childhood. I thought about the first time my mother asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I told her that I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to help people get better, to mend their broken bones. I wanted to be the kind of doctor who gave children balloons and lollipops anytime they had got shot. So here you are now, you've been arrested, right? And you're in these handcuffs and you have this moment. And do you remember what it was? You talk about the abuse that was going on in your home, but what was the trigger when you lost that innocence as a child?
I think the real innocence was lost when I was robbed. I got robbed at gunpoint, and this was early into me selling drugs. And what happened was I basically got lured out of the house where I was selling the drugs at. And one of the guys, he was a friend of mine's uncle, but he was dealing with drug addiction. And again, I was naive. I didn't know the desperation that drug addiction, you know, bred in people,
yeah.
You know. And so they lured me out of the house and, you know, under the guise of, you know, taking care of me and making sure I got transportation to the next place I was going. And then they robbed me at gunpoint. And I just remember at one point, which I talk about in the book, the gun being held to my head and just feeling the desperation and smelling the desperation. You know, one of the guys, he was a I think what they call polyaddicted, where he was addicted to crack cocaine as well as heroin, which is just an extreme combination of, you know, drugs. And so I just remember looking down these basement steps and thinking to myself that he's going to shoot me in the head and kick me down the stairs and nobody would find me for a couple of days. And I believe that the innocence, you know, relative to hope as a child, you know, was shattered at that point. There was an incident that I talk about in the book when I was younger that I think shattered my perspective of, you know, what it means to be a child that's loved and taken care of. But in terms of just that breakthrough in the streets, it was that moment after I got robbed.
So as you're out there and you're mentoring now, other young men who are dealing with some of these same challenges, how do you connect with them knowing that that innocence has been lost, right? There's a fire that they don't even want you to know that's gone, probably, right? They're trying to protect themselves and show you this tougher demeanor. How do you connect with them and encourage them when they're in that place? I mean, you know what that felt like. How do you reach them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very unique skill set to have, you know, because it's born out of tragedy, but it's a relatability, you know, and once they understand that you come from where they come from, that you've experienced the things that they saw, they bear witness to, or that they have possibly experienced themselves, there's a connectedness there, you know. And for me, I have an approach that, you know, as a mentor, and I have a different type of, I don't have like a mentoring program at this point because I'm doing a whole bunch of other stuff, but I mentor several young men and women and more informal, where they text me, they call me, and I just listen, you know. I think that there's an art to listening to young people. And respecting their humanity and respecting their experience and not dismissing and saying, hey, it'll be okay. Because sometimes it won't be okay.
Right.
And if it's not okay, then what is your plan A through Z to figure out how to make things, you know, to where you can actually deal with them when they're not okay. And I think all too often we just dismiss things up under the guise that it'll be okay. And for some of these kids, it won't be okay. But it doesn't mean that they can't survive and they can't overcome and that they can't thrive once they can recognize that, you know what, my mother may be addicted to drugs for the rest of my life. However, there are things that I can do to ensure that I don't become victim to that. And so in that instance, that's not okay. You know, it's not okay because you're up as a child. You're wondering if your mother's going to make it home at night, you know. But you have to figure out how do you make peace with that and then move forward in life. And so for me, it's listening. You know, the art is listening. The art is being vulnerable and being open and really, you know, when I wrote this book, when I decided to write it, I was hesitant for a couple of reasons. One is there were things that I was going to share that I had never shared publicly. And, you know, once you put something out, you can't retract it. It's out there in the universe, you know. And the determining factor for me was trust amongst the young men and women that I engage with. And that if I'm expecting them to step up to the plate and be authentic and be honest and transparent, then I had to be a model for what that looks like. And I had to be an example for them. And so, you know, this isn't just my story. This is our story. You know, this is the collective story of thousands of young men and women who have, you know, lost their lives in the streets, who have lost their lives to prison, who have been traumatized through gun violence. You know, this is, when you're reading this, it's not just Shaka. You know, this is the young brothers and sisters that you walk past every day. You know, our stories are intertwined. And so I knew that I had to tell the story.
So tell me what you were thinking. I was reading about the sentencing, and tell me what goes through your mind when you hear that you could spend the next 40 years in prison.
When I got sentenced, I just knew that my life was over. I mean, I was 19 years old. You know, and at 19 years old, you can't.
You were a baby.
Yeah, you can't even think two weeks down
right,
the line.
Right.
Excuse me, let alone decades down the line.
Right.
And the only guaranteed part of my sentence was the 40 years. So I was sentenced to 17 to 40 years, with the 40 years being guaranteed.
Tell me what that means, being guaranteed.
So that means that they didn't have to let me out until 40 years.
Okay.
However, I could earn a parole after 17 years.
17, okay.
And oftentimes people end up doing their maximum sentence, you know, just because we have a system that's so broken. And for me, when I got sentenced to that time, you know, 17 years is 2 decades, you know, and I couldn't see a life. I couldn't see a future beyond the immediate moment I was in. And so I just went to prison with this anger, this resentment, this bitterness, this resentment, and I found myself getting in more and more trouble.
I saw, or as I was reading, you had 7 years in solitary confinement. And in my mind, I was like, and I think at one point the longest stint was 4 years. Is that right?
4.5 years.
It's like torture when you think about 23 hours a day. You're locked up with 1 hour. And how does that, tell me what you were doing. What was James doing at that point in time that was landing him in solitary confinement like that?
Well, I broke almost every rule that they had in prison, which isn't uncommon. You know, you're young and you're angry and you're frustrated, and then you're dealing with this very racially charged environment, very antagonistic. You're dealing with officers who have no experience with, you know, inner city kids outside of the prison setting. So there's judgments. You come in, you know, the racial dynamic is unbelievable. You know, the majority of the prison population where I was at was African American or Latino. Majority of the officers were white, and so there was this immediate racial antagonism there. Some of it was we're from the inner city, officers from rural areas. And so, you know, judgments on both halves, you know. And so I found myself just breaking most of the rules that didn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense. I didn't typically follow along with it. And then there were other days where I just woke up and just didn't care. You know, I didn't care whether I made it out of prison. I didn't care what the consequences were of my actions. And so I found myself getting in more and more trouble. The 4.5 year stint that I served was different, though.
Was that at the beginning of the 7 years or towards the end of
That
the
was
seven?
the end. So
that was the end.
The last
Okay.
time I was in solitary confinement, I was in solitary for 4.5 years straight. And at this point during my incarceration, I was in a very different space. I was a leader in the environment. I was well respected amongst my peers, and largely because I was an organizer inside. I was an activist, and so because of that, that comes with a target. You have a target on your back when you're like fighting against policies that don't make sense, or fighting against things that you know to be wrong in the system, and organizing the men around issues that we cared about and that mattered to us. And typically when you're that type of person who stands up for yourself and you know the laws and you know the policies, officers don't typically like that. And so there was an incident that happened prior to the incident that led to me being in solitary with me and this officer. We had got into it about his attempting to deny me access to a recreation yard. But according to the policy, I knew I was right. And so when I cited the policy and quoted it and made sure that I knew what I was talking about, that rubbed him the wrong way. And literally within a few days, we got into another altercation, and he crossed the line by pushing me. And then I punched him and beat him up really bad. And so they sentenced me to an additional 2 years in prison and 4.5 years in solitary confinement.
Wow. So now you're in. So when you went in for that last 4.5 years, at that time it's 4.5 years in solitary confinement, or do they just keep adding on and you think you're going to get out? How does that work?
Well, part of the torturous part of solitary confinement is that they don't tell you when you'll get out. It's indeterminate. And so it's very arbitrary. It's up to the warden to start the process again. You release, then that goes to higher ups at in the system. So it's a step-by-step process. It's so arbitrary. It absolutely, it has no. And part of it is them not informing you. Part of that is the control part. Because you're very dependent on them to decide when, and it keeps you guessing. It can get you, very frustrated.
It's a mental game. That's
yeah. And it basically breaks people down. When I went in, though, the warden told me that I probably would never get out of prison, let alone solitary confinement. So, initially I was like, let's just talk. And then I realized that I had a neighbor across from me who had been in at that time. I went in I met him in 2000. So I had a year in, and he was on his 14th year in solitary. And then there was another neighbor who was on his 10th year, and another who did like 20 years in solitary. And so when the warden said that I probably would never get out, I began to understand why. We actually had a role that we call long-term solitary role, because all of us had just been told we would be there forever. So,
what's going on in your head day by day when you think you're getting out, you're not getting out, you think you're getting out? How do you mentally keep focus, keep your strength around you? Is this part of when you start the writing and the reading, or were you doing that prior to?
Well, it was, for me, I was really fortunate to be literate. And so I had read books about, why prisons themselves had been designed and what the intentions was behind designing maximum security and super maximum security.
That's interesting.
And solitary. And there was this one book I read called Cages of Steel. And it basically explained what the intentional purposes of solitary was designed to do and what would happen to a person the longer you kept them in there. And so it started breaking down like all of the symptoms. If you keep a person who is a leader and you surround him with people who have mental illness, at some point he'll start questioning whether he's the one who isn't sane, because he's not reacting to the environment the same way everybody else around him is reacting to the environment. Cutting off communication, making it harder for the person to communicate, makes you more reliant on the officers. And in turn, they tend to try to utilize that to manipulate information out of you. So it's just all these different things that I knew going in. And so whenever I would feel myself questioning, can I take one more day of this? You know, I would be reminded of the intentions behind solitary to break a person down. And I just refused to break. You know, I refused to become another broken soul. And I saw so much brokenness in that environment. It's one of the reasons that I'm such an advocate for the abolition of solitary confinement as we know it today, because the level of abuse for those suffering from mental illness is just unconscionable. You know, like, you know, we live in what's supposed to be one of the most civilized countries in the world,
Right.
yet we are allowed the torture of men and women who have mental illness, like diagnosed mental illness. And they probably make up 80% of who's in solitary confinement at any given time. And the level of desperation that I witnessed was just, you know, and a lot of stuff I couldn't even put in a book because I'm like, this is just, it's so raw, it's so barbaric that, you know, I don't want to traumatize people. I want to enlighten people. I don't want to like traumatize you, but it's a high level of trauma happening in solitary confinement all throughout the country right now.
But I think, I think what you share in your book is raw, and I think it has to be if you're going to continue to push for change, right?
Definitely.
I mean, people need to really see what's happening inside there, and I think you do a great job in talking about that in the book. It's hard for us to process because we don't know anything about the prison system. It's almost hidden, that we even privatize our prison system is that's a whole nother thing.
It's big business.
That's mind-boggling. It's big business. It's big business. A lot of dollars at risk. When you're talk about your mentors, the people that because there were several people that really kind of encouraged you, helped you refocus inside the prison system in inmates of yours. And I think when we think of mentor, when we hear the word mentor, most people are not going to think there's a mentor that can have that kind of influence, positive influence on you inside the system, right?
Yeah.
Because we throw away people in the prison system and we think once you go in, you know, we're done with you. There's nothing else that we could do with you. But that's not true. And you were heavily influenced in a very positive way. So talk about some of the mentors and what they meant to you.
Yes, it's interesting now because I get asked a lot about mentoring just because I'm such an advocate of you know, being a voice and being a listening ear for young people and sometimes peers and elders as well. And I mean, I have an incredible network out here of amazing people who are really well accomplished, and I learn a great deal from them every day. Just the way that they move through life, the life wisdom that they have, you know, the way that they've helped me navigate through life. They're just amazing, incredible people. You know, one of my mentors is you know, he's the director at MIT Media Lab, brilliant guy, Joy Ito, who I just learned so much from, you know, since I've been on this side of the wall. And so I had these really high level, you know, mentor type friends, but there's nothing like the men who contributed to my growth in prison. You know, these men, and I'm very intentional about not calling the men and women incarcerated inmates or offenders or felons or whatever other politically correct name people come up with, because I want to be very intentional about people acknowledging that these are human beings who at some point in their lives made poor decisions, and in some instances haven't made, they've just been accused of making poor decisions that landed them in prison.
Right.
But they're, you know, their fathers, their brothers, their uncles, and you know, aunts and mothers, and so I just try to acknowledge their humanity because they poured so much into me. And it wasn't in this, you know, cute, neat, agreed upon way. It was kind of like they recognized qualities that I had in terms of just the influence amongst the young guys. But I was getting in a bunch of trouble, you know, and they would come to me and just be like, you know, one day you're going to get out. You know, one day you're going to get out and you can take those leadership skills and utilize them for the greater good. And I would be going on, I don't want to hear that. I'm dying in here, you know. And they would be very insistent that, you know, I wasn't going to die in prison and that one day I would be able to utilize my, you know, natural abilities to, you know, have some meaningful impact. And I didn't want to hear it. You know, I didn't want to hear it. And what ended up happening is they discovered my love for literature.
Can I interrupt and ask, do Did you not want to hear it because you didn't believe in yourself? Did you not want to hear it because you didn't think it was possible? You weren't ready to hear it? What was that? What was that rejection? Was that protection? Were you protecting yourself? What was that?
It was a combination of things. Growing up with a father, for one, it was just hard for me to take instructions from another man when I grew up with a father that I didn't always listen to.
Okay.
But the other part of it was just hopelessness, you know, not feeling like there was another side. You know, I was immersed in an environment where it was chaotic, it was brutal, it was, you know, opportunistic. You know, I didn't see any positive lights. I hadn't seen anybody who got out and did something meaningful. I saw guys get out and come back. I saw guys get out and get killed. But I didn't see an example of what was possible. You know, only example we had at the time was the autobiography of Malcolm X. You know, and so Malcolm died before I was born, so that wasn't as tangible as like somebody actually getting out and walking the path. So, you know, it was just resistance to the idea based on the circumstances that I was in, you know, and being young and just being in a moment and realizing that, you know, this is what I have to deal with right now. I can't think about what's happening outside, otherwise I go crazy, you know, and so I didn't want to hear it, but what they did is they saw that I had this love for reading. And one of the guys, he introduced me to literature through little books that he had wrote, you know. And I mean, I had read books before. I was, you know, a smart kid or whatever. But I just read whatever was available to me. It wasn't like I was intentional. And so he saw, you know, he was sharing these books that he wrote, and it was just like little short stories about his community and the neighborhood he grew up in. It was about the streets and drugs, and then he introduced me to Donald Goines. And Donald Goines is probably the most famous, you know, author in prison culture. Like, I don't care what prison you've been in, you've encountered Donald Goines as much as you've encountered the Bible. And so once I began to read Donald's work, and Donald's a amazing storyteller, like a brilliant storyteller. Like, he brings you like so close to the street experience of the 60s and 70s that it just engaged you in a way that nothing else, it engaged me in a way that nothing else had before. And so I ended up reading his whole collection, which was probably about 13 or 14 books. And what happened was we had to go into a special room to get these books because sometimes guys would check them out and wouldn't bring them back. And so they made you fill out a disbursement form, which basically your guarantee that you would bring the book back, or they would charge your account for the cost of the book, and you would get a misconduct. So in this one room, they basically had all of the brilliant black writers. And so this is where I discovered the Harlem Renaissance. This is where I discovered, you know, J.A. Rogers and you know, Chancellor Williams and Ivan Van Sertima and all these great historians. And so I began to devour those books, and they started paying attention to that. They started selecting books for me and being like, well, read this, or what do you think about this? And then we would start having these debates. And you know, I was young, I was up for the challenge, and you know, and they were always questioning whether I was actually reading the books, because I was a very fast reader. And so they'd be like, well, what happened in this chapter? What was this talking about? What was this idea? And they would turn into like these really intense debates, and that was their way in, you know. And so they started just giving me information and it was never like, so they were never like the instructional kind of mentors. It was just like, we're going to provide you with information, and then we'll debate and we'll talk about it. And I ended up building real relationships with these men that carried on from prison to prison. And so when I would arrive at a prison, there was usually another elder there, you know, who somebody had told him, you know, one of my guys was going, you know, and then we'd end up just walking and talking and building. And that's why I pay so much homage to them. You know, these men are currently dying in prison. And
are you allowed to be in contact with them now?
Yes, I write through, they have an app that you can actually write, you know, send letters to. I try to make sure I send them books whenever possible. You know, sometimes we'll send in just, because I have like my core group of like friends. Like, these are guys I grew up with who are like my brothers. It's like 10 of them guys that I'm consistent with. They're the ones I'm most consistent with. And then I have probably 20 or 30 other men that I write periodically. But I'll send in pictures, just kind of like, hey, here's what's happening, here's the update. I'll send in articles. We used to do a newsletter, to just kind of like we tried to do quarterly, but it was just too much. But we would try to do that in a sense of like 100 different guys, just to make sure they're seeing, because to me it's important for them to see a model that you can actually do it if you put the work in, if you like trust and believe in yourself enough to like know that you don't want to go back to prison. So I do what I can to just stay
like you
visible
said, and just knowing that there's a way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. What is it like when you're in solitary confinement? And we'll talk about the letter that your son sent, but what is it like when you don't get mail?
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking in prison, period, when you don't get letters or cards or, just photos or something to say that somebody's thinking of you. Here's the struggles that I have sometimes when I listen to people's interpretation of what happens in prison. So some people say, well, you shouldn't have messed up, or you shouldn't have did this, etc. But I believe that you get out of people what you put into them. If you want people to return to society healthy and whole, you have to support them emotionally.
Yeah.
And then the other part is just we have fickle-minded people. We have family members who they keep it real when you're out here and you're risking your life, and you're providing for their lives. But then when you get locked up, all that goes away. We have fair weather friends. When everything is all good, everybody's there to support you. But when it goes bad and you really need somebody there, and people don't show up, like it hurts. It hurts to know that, you've given so much of yourself to, whether it's the streets or, just your loyalty to family or whatever the case may be, and then people don't show up when you need them. And so that's one of the things that I definitely utilize when I'm working with young men and women, because a lot of people have this false sense of allegiance. And they think that, well, my friends will never turn their back on me. They would never let me down. And I can guarantee you that pretty much 98% of the people in your lives will leave you once you go to prison. Literally everybody.
Wow.
When you go in the visiting rooms, it's usually mothers, fathers, a girlfriend. Somebody may, that may stick in, but for the most part, people abandon you. And I don't think that people have malicious intent. It's just out of sight, out of mind, and it happens. And so, when you're in there, like, letters mean everything, just pictures and photos, and it's not even like just to show love, but it's also to inform. Like, it was information that you need, so I send my guys information that's relevant to what their circumstances are, especially those coming home.
That's interesting. That's a good point.
Yeah, I came home to a different world.
Yeah.
I was clueless. And I was fortunate I had people around me. My ex-fiance, she provided me with all type of information, all type of content just to kind of prepare me for life after. And she prepared me for a lot, and then I came out here and it still wasn't enough
still
to
not
make
enough,
that leap, but something is
because things
better
have
than
changed
nothing.
so much.
Yeah,
and you've
dramatically.
got to try to absorb it all at one time, right? That's in front of you while you're still wrestling with, who am I in this society that puts up roadblocks for me every possible way it can. Talk about the letter that your son sent you that started you down a real path of self-awareness and changing and self-reflection, I think.
Well, the letter I received from my son is what I'm now calling the third in this trilogy of little miracles that led to my transformation. So the first was actually those mentors that we talked about earlier. I didn't recognize them for the miracles that they were until I got out. And I was able to look back and really reflect on
how much they had deposited
and how many of them I met along my journey and what had happened inside of me that allowed me to be receptive to their wisdom. And that's miraculous because I was so hard and I was so hell-bent on just like not listening to anybody and doing it my way.
But they saw a light.
But they saw a
still
light.
light.
Yeah, they saw a light, even when I didn't see it myself. And then the second was a letter that I got from the woman who, told me that she raised the man whose life I was responsible for taking.
This was David's godmother.
Yeah. And so she, that was the second miracle. And what that did is it awakened me to the possibility of forgiveness and love in a different way. But the third miracle, which I believe is the most important, was a letter I got from my son, my oldest son. I have two sons now. But that letter he wrote after his mother told him I was in prison. Excuse me. And it was something about hearing those words from my child that shattered all the prison toughness, all the street toughness, and made me really recognize that I had a responsibility because I owed him a father. And
Would you share that with us, the letter?
Yeah, sure. So in a letter, he said, "Dear Dad, my mom told me while you were in prison for murder. Dad, don't kill again. Jesus, watch what you do. Pray to him." And
did you pray?
You know what? I did. I meditated.
Did you believe in Jesus?
I didn't. I'm not a religious person. I'm very spiritual, though. I believe in the principles and the morals and the values that's attributed to Jesus. And but I studied theology while I was in prison. I just concluded that religion wasn't for me, but spirituality is something I feel deeply about.
Okay.
And I think that there are universal themes in all of the scriptures, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the Bible, the Dhammapada, the Tao Te Ching, whatever spiritual books people, get their nourishment from. And I've read all of them, I've studied all of them, and I just concluded I'm not, a religious person. But spiritually, the moral fibers that run throughout the course of these, great doctrines are things that I, try to apply to my day-to-day life. So, I have a very unique spiritual philosophy that's, a reflection of the way that I live my life. I think that the greatest scripture is the interaction between human beings in a real way, and our interaction with nature and the earth. When you look outside and you recognize there's no limit to the sky, I don't think there's no greater testament to, our spiritual connectedness. And so, to answer the question, I wasn't in a space where religion was a transformative, thing about my life, and it's kind of interesting now because that's what most people expect it to be, is that I had this come to Jesus moment, and it just wasn't like that, But even though I wasn't religious, just the power of those words coming from my son.
At that time he was
about 10 years old.
Yeah.
That was just mind blowing, and it made me realize that I needed to do something different with my life.
When the power, as I listened to you say the words, the power of the innocence and what he was writing.
Yeah.
Children have a way of expressing themselves in such a raw, innocent way that makes you step back and go, wow. And to know that he wrote you in that way, and that he was concerned about Jesus seeing what you've done. I thought that was really very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's profound. When you think about just the wisdom of children. My father told me something recently, in probably like the last 2 years. We were just having a discussion about fatherhood, and he said that we don't teach our children anything. They're here to teach us. And when I thought about that, it's like, no, we actually do teach. And I was like, no, he's right. Because even in the process of imparting wisdom and knowledge or disciplining your children, there's a learning curve that you go through as a parent.
Yes.
Because there's so much mirrored back to you and so much that's reflected back through their behaviors. And so, just getting that letter was just it was the last thing needed for me to take that leap to the other side. And it wasn't pretty, though. That's the thing about this book, and what I really wanted to get across to people is that the process is not pretty. You know, it takes work. You know, it takes hard work. It takes intention. It's not pretty on this side. You know, I've been out for 7 years, and there are things that I struggle with today. You know, and I've been home for 7 years, and there are things that are triggers that are, you know, hurtful, and things that there are moments when I feel rejected. I'm very successful, but I still run up against these rejections based on my past. I still run up against these judgments based on my past. There are certain freedoms and liberties that I will never have based on my past, and I deal with that daily, you know. And so it wasn't a pretty process. It wasn't just this complete, okay, you know, this happened, so now you have to be a good guy. It was work, you know, and it's a lot of work.
So how do you get up? How do you get up and do that every day? How do you do that process every day?
Some days.
I think I read where you were asked to speak at the White House, and then you got there and they wouldn't let you in.
Yeah.
Or that you were trying to, I think I read something that you were trying to go to Canada to
do a TED Talk.
Yeah, but you couldn't get in, and you actually did it out of New York.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? That's reliving it. I mean, that's why I talked about the courage at the very beginning, because there would be a lot of people who would say, there's no way, I'm just going to put this, I'm out, I want to put this behind me, and I'm going to move on. But you've chosen to write this book, to be out here, to use this as a platform for change, and you're talking about it. So you're having to relive a lot of these things over and over and over and over and over. How do you do it day in and day out?
Well, the thing that keeps me going is knowing the purpose, and that there's a purpose that's bigger than my personal narrative and bigger than my personal pain. And the reality is that, you know, there are millions of men and women right now in this country with felonies that are being discriminated against, permanently discriminated against, even though they've served their time, they've done their time, they've paid their restitution, and yet they still suffer. There are thousands who just want to do the right thing, who want to just get out, get a job, raise a family, and we don't give them the dignity of that second chance. And so, for me, I can't, in good conscience, know how to fix things and not utilize my voice in a way that can help us fix it. And you know, people just don't think about how dehumanizing it is to just want to work. Just want to work.
Yeah.
You know, just want to work.
Just want to work.
You know, how dehumanized it is when you go and try to get an apartment and they tell you you can't because you have a felony. You know, even though you served your time. So the sentence doesn't end with you walking out of prison. And I mean, there are people who have been out for 10 years, for 20 years, and they run into these things that we just take for granted. You know, like I travel a lot for a living. I can't get TSA because I have a felony that's 25 years old. Actually, it'll be 26 years. And I mean, in most people's mind, they probably think, it's not that big of a deal. You can go through the regular line until you're traveling multiple times a week in and out of
the time.
You know, the time consumption.
Are you familiar with T.D. Jakes, Bishop T.D. Jakes?
I am.
I was listening to a sermon of his a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about forgiveness, and one of the things he said is, God forgives. It's man who will never let you forget.
Yeah.
And that's what you're experiencing. Yeah. You have served your sentence, you've been released, but yet every day there's a reminder, a roadblock that man deliberately puts in the way that stops you from being able to move forward. And not everybody who's released has the strength that you have, you know, because they've already been in a system that's been beating them down. They've committed this crime, they've paid their sentence, they've paid their debt, and they have to deal with that. But now we're going to make them pay all over again. And then we don't understand the frustration of what they experience.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's the hypocrisy of the world that we live in. It's like on one hand, you're saying get out and move on with your life and become a taxpaying citizen. but then there's 50,000 roadblocks in the way to prevent you from doing that. And then we act shocked when people go back to what they knew.
Right.
And that's the difficult part, you know, is when I get, you know, men coming home who I knew in prison, they're like, you know, I'm trying to do this, I'm trying to do that, and I'm trying to point them in these different directions, and then they get hit with this reality that people are not forgiving, and they're basically crying on the phone like, man, I don't want to go back to selling drugs, I don't want to go back to the streets, but I got to take care of my family, so what am I going to do? And this is problematic throughout the country. You know, it's not that they don't want to work. If you've been in prison where you've worked for 17 cents an hour, you know, you'll work out here in society. You know, if somebody just give you an opportunity. And the things we just don't want to give people opportunity. And those of us who have succeeded, most of us just have entrepreneurial spirits. Like, I've done a lot of work with different organizations. I've taught at the University of Michigan. I've worked with a national organization that, you know, is about black male empowerment and community building. I currently work with Dream Corps with Van Jones and Dream Corps. And in every one of those instances, I basically had to create the job opportunity. Like, it wasn't just a traditional, you know, we're going to hire you. With the exception of the black male engagement, like, they hired me based on me, you know, applying for the job. But at that point when they did, I had won an award for my work as a mentor with that organization, and they saw the value that I brought to the table. But even then, it was a consulting job. So it's not real employment. It's not health care benefits. You know, I have a real job. I'm secure. So I haven't had job security in 7 years that I've been out.
Wow.
But I'm an entrepreneur, so I've been able to, you know, survive. So
you've been out. You've had this amazing journey where you've decided to share this with everyone. Tell me what it's like. What would you say to David's kids today? How would you, if you could talk to them today, what would you say to them?
You know, that's a tough one. But what I would say is that, you know, his life isn't in vain, and what happened that night is a tragedy that I always wish that there was a way that I could undo. And despite the reality that I can't undo it, if you pay attention to what I actually do now, you'll understand that it wasn't in vain. You know, and that, you know, all of our lives have purpose, even when they don't seem to make sense to us. Whatever we go through in life has a deeper purpose if we're willing to look at it as such. You know, what I will say to other young men and women who are growing up in these communities where gun violence is at extremely high levels is that the burden of living with the fact that you've taken somebody's life every day isn't something you want to wake up to. You know, it's a tremendous burden. It's something that never goes away. You know, you can take most crimes committed, you know, armed robbery, car theft, you know, jewelry theft, whatever you want to call it, like, those things are replaceable. You can't restore a human life once you've taken it.
Right.
And, you know, so the work that I do is really about multiple things. You know, one is prevention. You know, I believe that anybody who reads Right My Wrongs will come away with the tools to, first of all, recognize what's happening in the lives of young men and women, and then figure out what's necessary to, you know, ensure that they don't end up on this path. And I mean, I get letters all the time from parents that's like, you know, my son read this, my daughter read this, and it's completely shattered, you know, all of the things that they were going through, and now they're on a different path. The other thing was to really highlight what was happening in our, you know, criminal justice system that has recidivism rates at 70% throughout the country. So I just really wanted to tackle those tough issues, but in a very human way.
How do you think you'll have this conversation? You have a young son now. How do you think you'll have this conversation with him when he's older? About what you've been through. How do you share that with him?
You know, my young son, Sekou, he's a very precocious
He's
child.
brilliant. He's going to be brilliant. I've already met him. He's like amazing at 5.
But he's such an integral part of everything that I do. You know, we haven't shielded him from our past. We haven't had to, lay it out in any great detail. I mean, he's 5 years old,
Right.
but he's grown up alongside this experience.
Yeah.
And so, the biggest thing I feel like as a father, my responsibility is to protect him from other people's ignorance and selfishness. And, people will say, well, your daddy was in prison, or your daddy was this, or your daddy was that. And so my responsibility as a father is to show up in his life in a way to where nobody can tell him anything about me that he doesn't already know.
Yes.
And that he can be confident that his father is the man that will...
That he knows you. Right? Yeah. That's good.
So,
that's good. And how's your son? How's your older son?
That's a very difficult relationship. It's one of the collateral consequences of spending 2 decades in prison is that you can't repair those broken relationships in a short amount of time. I personally believe that my oldest son is emotionally traumatized from the experience of me being absent from his life, and that has played out in his life as it currently exists. And when I came home, I was hopelessly optimistic that we would just have this great reunion and ride off into the sunset as father and son. And unfortunately, it didn't work like that. He has his own things that he's dealing with, and I've tried to support him as best as possible as his father with a lived experience. And it's just tough. It's probably. I mean, I have many parts of my life that I don't talk about often. That are very difficult to deal with. Because I mean, there's no. Like, who do you talk to about being gone for 20 years, and they haven't lived it, they haven't experienced. So it's just a lot of things that I carry inside. That's one of them. The relationships with my 2 older children just didn't pan out to be what I envisioned them being. But, we're in contact. We talk here and there. And I used to feel really guilty about it until I stepped back and was like, he's a young adult. And I've done my part. I've did what I could. I can't relive the past.
You can't redo it, right?
But I did what I could to, ensure that he had access to me, and that whatever way we can kind of build those bridges. And it just hasn't turned out to be what I envisioned it to be.
Can I ask about the relationship with your mom? How's that?
Sure. The relationship with my mother is interesting, but not in a bad way. I mean, when we talk, we're good. She definitely was hurt by the book. She was hurt by me sharing, some of her painful moments. But once we really sat down and talked, and I just explained to her, like, it would be an injustice for me as a mentor to not be honest about what I experienced. And it wouldn't help anybody, And I told her, I was just like, I know that obviously this is hurtful for you to hear about, how I felt about the abuse. I'm like, but I'm really putting myself out here. I'm talking about, a murder I committed. And, and so, we navigated our way through that. And overall, I think we're okay. We'll never have that, mother-son relationship dynamic, and I've made peace with that.
I understand. So what is some of the work that you're doing on criminal justice reform? What would you like to share? What would you like for us to know? I know there's a goal to try to reduce the population, is it by 50% by 2025? It's kind of the goal. Yeah. What's something important there that we need to know that or that even we can do that would make a difference? So
it's a few things. So I just want to, so I was the Director of Strategy and Innovation for an organization called Cut 50. I'm still a collaborator with that organization. I no longer hold that position. And my role within the work that we're doing now is really that of, storytelling, sharing narratives of other men and women who have got out, who are living, successfully and contributing members of society, but who are still running up against all these impediments. And so my role is to help humanize the issue. For years, all we heard is statistics and data: 2.2 million men and women incarcerated, you know, high recidivism rate, but we really haven't saw the human side of that. And so my work is really now leaning more in the creative space of storytelling and really amplifying the humanity of the men and women inside. But what I believe that people can do immediately is, first of all, understand what the system in your community is like. Because every state has a different prison system. If there's an opportunity to go inside and volunteer, I highly encourage that. Understanding what policies and legislation may determine who gets out and who stays in, I think that's really important for people to understand. Helping to decriminalize mental illness, like we have so many people with mental illness in solitary confinement. Being intentional about getting some transparency. Like we live in a society where our prison system is very clandestine. Like people do not know what's going on, and then they wonder why when their family members come out, they're broken and have all these issues because we've basically fallen asleep on our watch. And I also encourage people to go out and see the film 13th.
Like amazing documentary.
Like it's on Netflix. If you don't have a Netflix account, you can sign up for the free 7-day trial and then shut it off after that.
Shut it off. You need to see it. Yes, and it's up for an Oscar.
Yeah,
Oscar nod. Yeah, congratulations to Ava DuVernay on that.
Yeah,
amazing.
Check that documentary out and start discussions. You know, one of the things that I think that Ava did brilliantly with the film is she didn't offer any solutions at the end.
Right.
She left it up for us to decide. And so I think it's enough work to go around for all of us. But really paying attention and being intentional about learning how the system, why the system exists. And 13th is a great place to start, because once you make that connection to slavery and the 13th Amendment, and you see what's happening with this free labor in here, and you see why people, big businesses are investing in it, then you'll understand why so many men and women
it is a great place to start. It's a good point, because it really, you need the foundation. You can't really do anything or really understand if you can have impact or where you can really get engaged without understanding what's happening. And she did a brilliant job of laying that foundation.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say read Right My Wrongs.
Read Right My Wrongs, absolutely.
Then watch the 13.
Yes.
Start study groups. Incorporate us into it. I'm easy access through social media. But let's talk about what works. You know, I for a long time, I've been identified as criminal reform, you know, criminal justice reform activist, and I no longer want people to identify me as such because I don't believe that you can reform this system.
Okay.
I think we have to abolish it. I've been convinced, and, you know, actually it's interesting because I instinctively knew it. I just thought it would be a real hard sell to really sell people on the idea of abolishing the system as it exists. But in recent times, you know, the more I understand there's a responsibility with being in the public eye, and that responsibility is to tell the truth about what really works and what doesn't. And reform doesn't work. Basically, it just reshuffles the deck and somebody going to get a bad hand. You know, even though somebody may get a good hand, a few people going to get bad hands. And so the thing is, like, we have to abolish the system as it exists, like the structural components of it. And it's a hard thing to do, you know, and reform is part of that. But it's so limiting, you know, and I think that in order to abolish it, we have to be honest about what it is and why it is. We have to be honest that this is a big business industry where people can work for these companies while they're in prison and then can't get hired once you walk out. You know?
Billions of dollars.
So people can hire you while you're in prison for $1 a day, and then you can't even fill out an application at those same companies when you get out and get paid a working wage, you know. So the hypocrisy within the system, like, we have to abolish that. We have to abolish the profit motive. Prison is a very profitable place. This is why it's the only place that has a 70% failure rate, but still ends up being profitable.
Wow.
You know.
Thank you. I'm sitting here thinking about what you just said, and my mind is just like racing. You said the same companies that they work for in prison, they can't go and fill out an application and work for those companies outside of the prison system.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's deep. Like, we have a basically 100% employment rate in prison, but, you know,
Wow.
Our unemployment rate out here is probably what, 10%, 11% if you're lucky.
That just hearing that just blew me away. I hate to say this, but we are so out of time. I'm just sitting here going, oh my God, where did it go? This is such, I so appreciate this discussion.
I appreciate you having me.
Because it's a great book. You've got to get it. Righting My Wrongs, bestseller list.
Yeah, New York Times bestseller.
New York Times bestseller. And paperback just came out?
Last Tuesday.
So
Super excited about that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so if people want to reach you, what's your Twitter handle?
Shaka Senghor. You can find me on all social media at Shaka Senghor.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to wrap up here because if not, I'll keep going and I think I'll get in trouble with those engineers out there. But this was amazing. There's so much in this book that we didn't even get to touch on. And so much that you have done. Again, I just can't tell you how much I think your journey is courageous.
Oh, thank you so much.
To be out here talking about this and willing to step out and let us see such an intimate part of your life and what you're having to endure on a day-to-day basis to champion and tell this story over and over. So thank you for that. Thank you for being a part of Book Circle Online. Catch us next time for a great book. We appreciate it. Love your support. You can catch this on bookcircleonline.com at any point in time. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again.
From Managing Editor Jason Squamata, Executive Producers Maria Menounos, Phil Svitek, and Kevin Undergaro, we would like to thank you for tuning in to Book Circle Online. For more discussion, go to bookcircleonline.com. And if you have comments, questions, or book title suggestions, write us at info@bookcircleonline.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this is Book Circle Online. BCO, join the circle.